All right, so this is the second part of our talk. Super excited to introduce Tim. If you've been following Flutter for any amount of time, our next speaker needs no introduction, but here we go anyway. Tim leads product management for Flutter and Dart. He joined Google in 2017 after 17 years leading client platform and developer teams at Microsoft. You may remember him from Implementis' presentation at Flutter Live in December announcing the release of Flutter 1.0. So let's give a warm Flutter NYC welcome to Tim.
Thank you. Yeah, so we thought we'd do something a little bit different for this second half. Partly because I don't have like a big presentation to give, partly because we thought this was just a nice sort of small informal setting, great to kind of make it a little bit more interactive. So I've got a couple of just sort of opening comments, sort of just where are we at, what are we thinking about more broadly in terms of the product, and then our goal is to kind of, as mentioned, sort of turn it over to be more like an AMA and ask us anything. So whether it's the kind of the Reddit style questions about would you rather fight 100 duck-sized or horse-sized 100 duck-sized horses or one horse-sized duck.
What subs are you on?
That's the AMA channel.
Oh.
That is the AMA channel.
Okay. I'm just on Kids Are Stupid.
There you go.
That's what I listen all the time.
It's all about leveling. So yeah, so just a little bit of sort of early sort of just thoughts about Flutter. One question I often get asked by folk is why does Google invest in Flutter? What's our motivations, right? Because sometimes people kind of have these sort of speculations, and sometimes they're sort of like, well, obviously you're doing it because da 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 da, and it's often interesting what the dot 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 is. It's sometimes kind of quite extravagant. You know, you're harvesting all our data and you're going to extract it and sell it to the Russians, or there's some kind of crazy sort of preposterous sort of ideas. For us, the starting point for Flutter is a couple of things. Number one, as Kevin said, as a company, we like to experiment and explore directions. We like to kind of get ahead of things. Things like Chrome initiate experiments. Google famously has the 20% sort of model of encouraging people to start experiments, and sometimes those experiments turn into projects, and sometimes those projects are successful and they take off. We have other teams within Google right now that do things like Area 120. There's a whole sort of incubator internally within Google for interesting ideas that people have that they want to turn into real products and projects. So part of it is that, but the actual real reason why it kind of turned from one of those experimental sort of shower thoughts, if you like, into something that is real and tangible and staffed to the tune of 100 plus engineers, is that we have the same problems fundamentally that I think most of you have as well. We have engineers building the same thing multiple times for several different platforms. And engineers are perhaps the most precious resource that Google has, even more than the Chelsea Market building. The engineers are the lifeblood of our company. It's the place where the innovation, our own agility comes from. And so when you go to a team like, I don't know, Google Photos or Ads, and you say, we've got to go and write this same piece of software for iOS and Android and TV and watches and Windows and web and Mac and Linux and all kinds of other sort of things that might or may not even be public at this point. That becomes a very inefficient process for us. And so we're also looking for solutions to the same things that we think most external people are as well. So what Flutter gives us is the productivity that you've seen, things like hot reload, the flexibility to target multiple places, and also hopefully the power to build these beautiful, rich experiences that are kind of what we aspire to with Flutter. So we're seeing that happen within Google at the moment. Ads was one of the first teams to adopt Dart and then Flutter, and as Kevin's mentioned, some of our ads app, if you actually manage your mobile campaigns through a mobile device, that's taking place using Flutter. At I/O this year, we announced Assistant have made a big bet on Flutter. And are using it increasing numbers of the screens on the Google Home Hub devices. what we call the smart display platform that powers all of those devices. That's a Flutter experience, and their goal is, as they continue to replace every screen on that, to be a Flutter experience. And again, that gives them tremendous flexibility in development. They can develop in simulators. They don't have to deploy it to a device and sort of compile and drop it down to different kinds of devices. Gives them also that productivity.
There's actually an interesting anecdote there, which is the genesis of the Flutter Web project was they wanted a way, they had an experience now. The system has very static content generally. And they had a web experience, which is great. It's easy to deploy. You can give it to your people testing localization of how the weather gets rendered and everything else. And they wanted to move to a dynamic experience and code it in something native. And it's like, oh, but we lose our ability to do it on the web. And so just for them, so this is this native embedded hardware thing, right? But being able to support web as well is huge for them, because now they don't have to have every one of their testers or localizers and people doing accessibility also have an expensive device. They can just open Chrome. Which is, and to see that where we've come now from that kind of initial experiment was really exciting.
Yeah. So general progress to date, we obviously shipped our 1.0 back in December last year. We had a 1.2 at Mobile World Congress in February. We shipped a 1.5 release at I/O. Don't worry, we do know how to count incrementally in individual numbers. We've been shipping interim releases to the beta channel, and roughly every quarter we ship something to the stable channel. Our plan is to ship another stable release in the next 30 days, hopefully significantly sooner than that. We're particularly targeting at the moment change that will enable 64-bit for the Android Play Store, which is something that is upcoming requirement from the Play Store. So we should have a build. We've just been backwards and forwards on the chat all afternoon about this. We're hoping to get a build to the beta channel very, very soon, in the next 24 hours or maybe Monday, depending on how things go. And that build will ultimately get promoted through to the stable channel. For now, our primary focus is continuing to get deeper in terms of the mobile, adding features like richer add-to-app support. We have good add-to-app support in the 1.7 release, as I guess it probably will be called. But we want to be able to do more. We want to make it easier for people to pre-warm the Flutter engine. Normally the splash screen is the time for loading resources and things like engines. When you embed Flutter into an existing app, of course, that means that might load at the point that you get to that screen, and we want to give people a chance to pre-warm the engine and do some of those things, to be able to have multiple Flutter pieces, to have Inception-style experiences where Android or iOS code contains Flutter, which itself in turn contains Android or iOS code. And so lots of kind of advanced scenarios we're kind of working on there, both for our own internal needs and also for some of our customers. We're working on, as Kevin's mentioned, non-nullable by default for Dart, which is something that, of course, lets you verify in a sound manner that there are no null reference potential exceptions in your code by establishing up front which types can be nullable and which cannot.
And hopefully that will mean we give you tighter code too. Like right now we inject null checks because this is a great example of JavaScript, right?
Yeah.
Like 0, an empty string, and null and undefined, all plus 1 give you 1. And so you want to make sure you guard against those things. And so we actually will be able to give you tighter, smaller native code, JavaScript code.
That's very true.
It's very cool.
True. Other things we're working on, you saw Kevin demonstrate the dev tools. We're investing more into that experience. We see that as the signature development debug and sort of runtime profiling experience. So we're continuing to invest in that. There's been some nice things that we've done in cooperation with teams like the Visual Studio Code team that mean we'll be able to embed some of that stuff into Visual Studio Code and be hopefully able to make that experience not a separate window, but to be kind of a more embedded experience. What else? We're looking at all the different things that Apple announced at WWDC a couple of weeks ago. There's obviously some, as with every year, there's some things that they announced for the latest release of iOS, and so things like some of the dark mode support, some of the textures. They've made some changes to some of the controls in terms of how they adapt to color themes. So all of those things we'll also see as things we'll be wanting to get into place before iOS 13 is available, so you can just naturally take advantage of those pieces. So yeah, those are some of the things I guess we're kind of working on right now. Other things I should probably say before I open up to questions. We really do value everything that everybody does. Flutter is an open source project, which for some, in some situations, in some projects, means that the code is there, but good luck sort of participating in any way with that. For us, when we say open source, we really mean it's open, not just for us to distribute, but it's open for us all to contribute to. Our true goal for Flutter is it becomes a multi-organization, multi-contributor project where you're as empowered to contribute and add, whether it's features or bug fixes, documentation, whatever it is, to the product, and be co-collaborators with us in building this. We of course, we are a primary sponsor of it. We've put a lot of investment in it. We continue to plan to do so. But there's a reason why we deliberately chose it not to be in the Google organization in GitHub. We put it in the Flutter organization because we see it as a community-wide project.
And keep in mind, even things like if you read the docs and like the grammar's broken, like that's a perfect first pull request.
Yeah.
And what's funny is like it's like an experience in a room where like you get the power of silence. Like the first time you speak, the second time is much easier. So I'm so happy when I see those little, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I put 3 N's in when or whatever, and and then you get started.
Spell when with 3 N's?
I was trying to think of an example on the fly. I could say you're him and ha longer to find them. You should probably go on.
So a couple of things just directly related to that. Firstly, part of that kind of community thing is we do a quarterly survey, a developer survey. I imagine many of you may have filled it in. We had 7,000 responses to our Q2 survey. We did something a little bit new this time. We put a little pop-up in the VS Code and Android Studio tool windows to try and broaden our reach, not just to those who are following our every left and right turn, and try and sort of broaden our outreach. We also have started translating the survey into Chinese, since we have a sizable Chinese community, and again trying to sort of broaden our outreach. And one thing again I think we do, which is pretty unique for even an open source project, is we publish the results of those surveys. We have to be a little careful because of personally identifiable information, but we aggregate and summarize, and the team I think do a really good job of being fairly transparent about what we're hearing, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. The sort of TLDR, if you like, the sort of the top line on this time, I've spent last week reading through 120 pages of verbatim sort of comments. We asked one question: is there anything you'd like to tell the Flutter team? And lots of people had lots of things to tell.
He had the highlighter out on his desk and was going through and.
Yeah. I would say, to super high level summarize, people are very happy in general. We have something like a 93% satisfied response rate. In the US, I think it was 66% of survey respondents are very satisfied with the products, which both those two, by industry measures, are pretty unparalleled. The kinds of things that people wanted to see more of. Documentation came up both as a highlight and a low light. People love the documentation. They want more of it. People want more samples. People want better, more applied samples, more recipes and things that could be added, some more conceptual content. So we're continuing to invest in that. There were quite a few comments about the number of issues which have been creeping up on the issue log. If you go to GitHub Flutter issues, you'll see that we're now just over 6,000 open issues. And that is actually just a reflection of our, I guess, of the growing audience for Flutter. People are posting more and more questions. And as a team, we're slightly drowning, candidly, in just the sheer quantity of questions. Sometimes they're actual bugs. Probably 4 out of 5 new incoming issues are more in the vein of how do I do this? And those
Stack
are not the kind of
Overflow.
questions that we are easily able
Tell
to
your
field with our
friends.
audience.
'Cause they help us a lot. Like, start with Stack Overflow if it's a how-to. It really helps a lot.
Yeah. So people have noticed that our issue tracker has been growing in numbers. We have plans to hire some some contractor help to help us work through some of the backlog there and get our issues fully labeled, triaged. Those that are how-to questions to sort of encourage people to go to Stack Overflow, those that are bugs to make sure we've got solid repos and so on and so forth. And then lastly, we heard comments about the ecosystem and desire to see more high-quality plugins, particularly some of the most common things like camera, audio, Bluetooth, Firebase, maps, web views, and so we're continuing to work on some of those, and we also are looking at ways to pull together the community to solve some of those, because there are so many plugins that one could theoretically create. One of the things we've seen is that sometimes there are 5 people who come up with the same idea to work on a particular plugin, like contacts. And so there'll be 3 or 4 different contact plugins published, all of which that are good in some areas and weak in other areas. Maybe somebody's an Android developer, not an iOS developer. So we're trying to kind of pull some of those together and have people work a little bit more formalized on that, and working with some of the community leaders to see if we can kind of aggregate some of that, the good work into a single thing.
Tim, how are you doing that?
How are we planning to aggregate that?
Trying to get people to come
So we're talking about setting up a. You can think of like the things that we do are essentially the first-party ones, right? Then there's sort of the broad things that are third-party ones. We're thinking about kind of creating essentially some kind of second-party category, somewhere in the middle between those two, where people can pull together and say, hey, this is something I'm going to work on, setting some style guidelines, some standardized sort of best practices for plugin development, and then having people, rather than creating their own GitHub repo for some of those things, encouraging people to contribute them to a common repo that we can have community-appointed administrators work on, so that if you start working on a plugin and then you get busy and disappear off to do something else, there are others who can also be participating in it. It stops being one person who's fully accountable for something from end to end.
I mean, even something as simple too. We're working on things on the package site so that you can actually create an organization or I forget exactly the terminology they have, but you can basically create a publisher.
Yep.
And you have many people under that umbrella. So this idea that one uploader leaves and like who has the keys to upload, you can actually formalize how you can group those people together and make it easier to upload as a publisher. And that also should help with some notions of reputation. Mm-hmm. So you can see like, oh, okay, it's not just one person that has good reputation. It might be a publisher that has good reputation, and that might represent many developers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So last thing I'll say in terms of, before I hand it over to more broad questions, again, thank you. There are lots of ways you can help us build a better product. Participating in communities like this is super valuable, helping us tell the story of Flutter. Things like helping us with issues is actually a really valuable way you can contribute. If you're a bit nervous about contributing code to the Flutter repo, there are ways you can help with reproducing issues, helping others who are less comfortable with Flutter create reproducible bugs that we can work on. Documentation, again, remains a big opportunity. We've started tagging some of the issues with a label that says something along the lines of good first contributor project, and that's another way to kind of quickly sort for and filter for some issues that you might be able to help with. But that's kind of like our state of the union, I guess. We're working hard. The team has doubled in size over the last 6 months. The product's adoption has probably doubled over the last 6 months. So it's encouraging to watch this continued growth in usage, and we know we've got a lot of work to do. We're not complacent about what's left on the backlog, and we're working hard to continue to make it hopefully a better product for all of you.
So since now we have the web tools, or at least has there been any interest in trying to getting it to work on Chrome OS, maybe with Crostini, getting Flutter there? I'm just curious of what, if anything, in the surveys might have shown anything.
Yeah. So Chrome OS, we actually have supports today as both in terms of developing and in terms of consuming. Chrome OS is kind of like this virtualized sort of OS. It's kind of clever in many ways. The core of the operating system is really a fairly thin virtualizing layer. There's a very, very thin Linux environment that hosts several other environments. So Crostini, as you mentioned, is essentially a virtualized Linux that is essentially user mode Linux. And that is capable of running Visual Studio Code. We published at I/O instructions for setting up everything and getting everything up and running to build Flutter apps there. There are a few rough edges because it's kind of complex. You've got this Linux-based environment that has to connect to Android.
So it's got to like talk through. Basically, they shouldn't be talking, or at least there's some restrictions on the talk.
Yeah. So like ADB debugging and things like that are complex. There's some OS changes that are coming in Chrome OS that are making some of those things a lot easier. And then the other side, of course, is that Chrome OS also includes an Android environment virtualized. And that's how the Chrome OS team wants to see applications created and distributed, because the Play Store recognizes that. So with Flutter, we're not targeting the Linux virtualized environment, we're targeting the Android virtualized environment. And again, a lot of the work we've done over the last couple of months to support that has been support for desktop-like metaphors like keyboard and mouse and resizability and those kind of things. But go to the Chrome OS web page now has instructions about Flutter development. So yeah.
And what's great as a web person, so the first time I ran the gallery, I had to click with my mouse and drag the scroll, because there's no scroll bars in Flutter. And so actually a lot of the work that's happening on focus rectangles, like you can click tab between things. Scroll bars exist. We don't get exactly for free on the web, but you want that on the web as well. And so a lot of the work that's happening to enable Chrome OS or just desktop in general also helps the web. So
this is a bit of a tiny two-parter. First off, iOS bit code. I know that's been kind of a contentious issue in terms of trying to, secure the iOS side of Flutter. Like, it's hard for me to sell to my bosses the ability to use Flutter in a more secure context. I mean, granted, we're already using Flutter for yet to be released app that we're working for one of our top clients. However, due to the fact that security is now a big thing of ours, that we may end up having to pass security audits from third parties. The iOS part might suffer from there because bitcode is not supported in Flutter, and therefore you can't harden that iOS side. Is that even in the roadmap at the moment? Because I know eventually Apple might just one day require that for any App Store submission. And the second part of my question is, having to, there are libraries out there that handle both Cupertino and Material, yet there isn't anything, aside from demos that I've seen in I/O about handling both platforms, there isn't any officially sanctioned way to, there isn't an officially sanctioned library that would seamlessly handle both in a UI agnostic manner. Instead of having to, in other words, creating an app that just has a scaffold that you don't care whether it opens, whether it's a Material or Cupertino one. You just care that it resolves to that particular platform.
Yeah.
Is that something that might be addressed in a future plugin that's an officially sanctioned one?
Yeah. I'll try and answer both those questions fairly quickly. The bitcode side, yes, we're investigating it. Bitcode is today required for Watch and Apple TV, but it's not a requirement for others, and indeed the games that are out there do not use bitcode either.
But banking apps, any apps that deal with that deal with having to pass security audits by third parties, they're going to require having to harden it using bitcode and obfuscation.
Yeah.
Like you can't even use IXGuard for to secure to obfuscate the binary code on iOS. So
yeah.
It's going to be hard to create a banking app with Flutter if a third party security firm is not going to approve an app that doesn't have bitcode enabled on iOS.
Right. I haven't honestly heard it so far, but again, we're still in early days as a security requirement. But I'm willing to believe that is a possibility. We're looking into it. The simplest way for us to get there is LLVM and to implement an LLVM backend. We have a prototype of working of that, and LLVM can target bitcode. I fully expect that we'll have that at some point in the next N months. I'm not going to be too specific there,
right.
But we're actively looking at that at the moment. To the second question. About Cupertino and material. In many ways, maybe Will might want to speak to that because he's the material engineer.
Hey, that's a really common question that we get. Don't break my hands. It is a very common request that we get that people would like a better experience in being able to automatically have UI and UX change between iOS and Android.
Yes.
One of the things that we've asked the community for is a little bit of help defining the scope of that problem. There's an open issue on GitHub, don't have the number of it, but we could look it up afterwards, where we're asking for some feedback on exactly what features you want in that. One of the things is that a lot of people have a gut reaction that it should just go from material to Cupertino, but Cupertino is not as comprehensive as material. Apple doesn't actually define a design system. They have the iOS visual design language, which is a bit of sprinkling of style and then some more basic guidelines for UX. That's what the HIG is. So with material, you can kind of put in input and then use the components and get out an app. You can't do exactly the same thing in Cupertino. So we'd love some help figuring out exactly what the experience should be when that switch flips there, and then that will really help us finish this problem for you.
Right. I guess the biggest gripe right now is like having to pick, like if you're designing using a scaffold and then let's say you want a bottom tab and you want it to be iOS-like where each tab has its own navigation stack. That translates well to iOS, but within Android you lose that context because with bottom tabs,
exactly.
you have a single stack. So
specifically with bottom navigation, that as an isolated problem is something that we're looking into. We're trying to see right now one of the problems that comes along with bottom navigation is the transitions are different, the expectations of the developer experience are different, so that makes it very complex to have just a switch like that. But as far as the look, we do believe that if we can make it a lot easier for you to at least get the look of an iOS UI tab bar versus the look of a material bottom navigation bar.
Yeah, that's all that really matters, whether or not there's like parity, almost. I'm not asking for like full one-to-one.
Well, you're not, but I'm getting it from other people.
No, of course, obviously. But I guess the bottom line is that perhaps maybe material needs to, may have to adopt some of these things because a lot of these developers are shoehorning the iOS-specific navigation into Android for,
And I can tell you actually on a larger scale, material itself is, we have a research project going on right now where it's to solve a problem. We're trying to figure out where material is being successful in an iOS UI and where it might be more of a user's expectation to have a certain different widget. We have a few variances right now where the switches, we say, don't use a material switch on iOS because nobody else does. Use a UI kit looking switch. Center your titles. Use the proper chevron instead of the back arrow. We think there's a bunch more of those that we need to find, and so we're kind of looking into that right now. If you have any feedback on that, I've been asking at these events for a year actually. We want to know what they are. Because it's a lot of times, again, people have this expectation that something should change. And I think we do too, but we just really want to nail what that is, even on material, so that when material runs on iOS, it's more to the user's expectation and looks like other apps that are in there. And then the differences that we do keep are the ones that are backed by research, where we say, we happen to know because of extensive research that this experience actually is better maybe than the one that you'd be used to in other places. But it's very important to us, and you're talking about something very real. So thank you. Yeah.
So when are you guys going to finish Google Maps for Flutter? I noticed it's missing info window, I think.
Uh-huh.
And when are you guys going to have it for the web?
I'll let Kevin answer the web one. Finish is a big word. There's a lot in the maps. There is info window. I think there's some issues with markers and a couple of other pieces there. That team is a little stretched at the moment, and you've also probably seen that in the plugin pull requests. There's too many that have not been reviewed and embedded in the product yet. One of the things we're trying to do is to narrow our focus as a team, and again, part of this sort of plugin sort of reintegration is to say, here are the 10, the 15 plugins that we have the capacity to really own and sort of take to the nth level. It sounds like a bit of spin. The reality is we're working on it, I think you can expect to see continued improvements, but they are coming slow. We need more heads on that problem for sure.
Do you take contributions, and how soon does someone look at it to feedback?
Yeah. Again, if I'm honest, that's been a gap. I think what we've discovered as those plugins matured and we got more contributions, we realized we didn't have good test infrastructure to enable that. So the first thing that the teams did after 1.0 was actually to sort of stop building more and more stuff and accruing technical debt, and to go back and actually build out a better set of plugin testing, ingestion harnesses. That work is, I think, about done at this point, and now they're able to ramp up. They've also hired 2 new people, so I think the problem will get better. It's not as good as it needs to be, for sure.
And as far as on the web, just like iOS and Android, like thankfully the Maps team has done all the hard work for us, because there's already web Maps components. I don't have any direct technical knowledge, like if the licensing, because there's some things around how you license it or access the API. I don't know if there's differences, native versus web. I know it has been discussed as our engineers is one of the first things we look at, which actually surprised the heck out of me, but they're audacious people, and they realize that doing a more complicated plugin earlier is good, because it means we'll find more of the kind of gnarly issues. So I don't have any specific dates. We're starting to dig in earnest now, and obviously once the merge happens, that's one of the big blockers for us actually digging on plugins, because you can't publish you have to publish Maps plugin, the Maps plugin web. We didn't want people to deal with that, so we wanted the merge to happen first. But we'll be looking at all the plugins, and again, prioritizing and picking the ones that are highest priority first. But I know Maps is on that list.
My question and topic is more around the web. So I'm in financial services, and over the past few years I've been a part of several teams that have been building BWAs using React and Electron, and it seems that there's a pretty big investment across financial services to go in this direction. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on comparing the 2 frameworks, and not from taking it of which one is better than the other, because it's kind of a useless argument, but more of just comparing the 2 and where you see some strengths and weaknesses across, and then B, what your vision and where you see maybe both frameworks heading, because I know frameworks evolve consistently.
Absolutely. I wish I knew more about React. I hadn't spent much time in that world. I did more Angular stuff. So line item comparisons with React I can help with much. What I can say, it's kind of a layered question and a layered answer, but it's super exciting to me. And I'll start with a story. One of the first questions we got as we started talking about Flutter Web was like, oh, well, you're gonna have to create a new compiler to compile Flutter to the web. It's like, we have the compiler, like it's just Dart code, right? It's JavaScript. And the artifact you end up with is exactly what you'd expect. Like, we actually don't generate, well, we do generate HTML for you. It's very small HTML, and it's just JavaScript. And so there's no, in fact, targeting, in my opinion, targeting the web and doing things like PWA is so insanely straightforward with Flutter Web, because Flutter has a very concrete notion of your assets, and you define them, and you reference them by path. And so and even the fonts you use, all those things. And so you start in many ways with a more structured set of inputs than you do in a lot of web cases. Like, it's very formalized. And what I aspire to here, there hasn't been much work, again, we're focused on the merge. What I aspire to is doing things like just giving you a PWA that just write should be really easy. And again, PM's talking here, should. But I've done some experiments there, and it actually has been insanely straightforward. And so, doing the right caching and making sure you set up the manifest correctly so it invalidates correctly. Again, because we have a strong type system, because we understand all the assets coming in through one pipeline, doing it right should be much easier. And so anything you can do in a PWA, like again, it's back to this, PWA doesn't care how your HTML looks or CSS, it's the slice stuff, right? So, if you have a good understanding of your assets, you know how to define the manifest, you know what your caching behavior is, all those things will be very straightforward with Flutter Web. And so then the upside for me is, and again, a PWA maps really well to what you think of as an app experience on the web, right? This notion of, I want to understand what my URLs are, and the scope of the app. It tends to focus on more things that are like kind of SPAs, single page apps. And those kind of things, you play with our demos today, right? Like, we know how to do the URLs and all that stuff so that it's nicely composed. So I think it'll be a really good solution. The devil's obviously in the details there around what your backend does and how you manage those things. But again, all those things, like, it's just JSON. Like, there's no magic there, right? HTTPS and JSON, how you handle auth, redirects for authentication, all that will just work. Like, it's just JavaScript at the end of the day.
React's awesome. I mean, there's a lot that we've been inspired by with React as we built Flutter itself.
Hot reload was...
you won't hear me kind of talk bad about it. I think the differences are more sort of philosophical, if you like, in terms of what they're trying to achieve. React was very much around, cleaning up the web, if you like. React Native was kind of like taking that same sort of framework or sort of creating something mobile that used the native UI components of mobile and brought some of the React principles and models to it. I guess we're trying to build something a little bit different because we start with the concept that we want to build a portable UI toolkit. We really started with Fuchsia, which is our experimental operating system that we don't talk a lot about. But we built Flutter as the UI framework for a native operating system. And then iOS and Android originally were the first artifacts of taking it somewhere else sooner that we could put in production. The web was another place for that. But again, I think we're trying to solve slightly different problems. It's easy to kind of see them as sort of, every press article. People love to write those kind of Clash of the Titans kinds of articles. But I think, as Kevin's mentioned, the use of things like Dart and a strongly typed language, the goals we have around creating a framework that is that targets each of these places with the same code. Those are our goals. And,
when you're targeting a non-Google company, small, medium, or large, are you kind of trying to sell to CTOs and CEOs, or are you trying to sell to like the engineers on a mobile team? And what is like the overall strategy of getting to these people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's kind of different, I think, for every company we kind of have the conversations with. What we see is a lot of companies come to us because they've heard of Flutter and they want to kind of know more about it. The pitch, if you like, the way we talk about Flutter is the same four pillars that we used at Flutter Live. We think of it as fundamentally, our focus is building beautiful apps, fast, that the apps themselves are rapid, that they're productive and easy to develop, and that the product is open. So those are the, if you ask me to kind of do the business level pitch, that would be what I'd anchorage around. The challenges of adopting Flutter or of selling Flutter are often less technical. The kind of conversations that are often more interesting are that most companies that care about beauty and speed are today building native applications for both iOS and Android. And so the preconceptions from the teams are, but I don't believe that cross-platform frameworks can deliver that kind of thing. So there's that kind of obstacle to overcome. And then the second obstacle is purely a political stroke organizational one, if you have two teams today with two team leads and two architects building applications, an environment that lets you target both from the same thing is sometimes a little scary, right? Well, is it him or me? Which of these two teams is going to evaporate? And so we care about sort of trying to figure out ways to tell that story.
You build twice as much.
That's I think David was one of the first people who kind of came up with that as a soundbite, and I like that. Flutter lets you do more with the same resources. So, yeah.
So I had a question about, so interesting thing about Dart kind of reminds me of the Control Logics platform. It's an industrial automation platform you can use to run your palletizer or crane system or conveyor or something like that. Has there been any projects to use like Dart to use to control like a control system, like a plant automation or a lighting system, or like these rock concerts? They have kind of like a real-time control. Has anybody tried it, or could it work to do those kind of real-time kind of thing?
Yeah.
Wish Michael was here.
Yeah.
We had an experiment to do this, and it was called Dartino. It's one of those things I shouldn't even bring up because now it's like you die twice, like once when you're dead and once the last person speaks your name. So like, oh no, it's still alive. You know what I mean? Coco, good movie. So the embedded space is a complex space, and the demands are really high around CPU and memory and just how fast you can get back in the real-time loop. And we're picking our battles, and so that's one of the battles we're not picking explicitly. And one thing I can say, this thing I'm actually excited to say about, it's like portability Dart is kind of exciting. Dartbug.com is just like this little thing that's a redirector, so you can put a Dart SDK issue, dartbug.com/thing, and it redirects to GitHub for you, like a simple thing. That's running on Cloud Run. So like doing Docker and containers and all those things, like we run great in those environments. And I just saw the latest demo for Raspberry Pi for $35, and like someone's running multi-monitor on a Raspberry Pi, with keyboard and mouse. And so, low-level embedded systems like running on batteries, at least, alkali, rechargeable, like we're not really designed to go down there, but anywhere you can run Linux for the most part, check your chip. But like something like a Raspberry Pi, there's lots of people playing there. We want to be very careful around, in terms of our priorities, we dip into server a little bit, but really we're focused on the client experience, both in the language and just the framework work we do. But our package site's running on servers, and we're very proud of it, and we do little experiments there. There have been people who've done driving displays using Raspberry Pi, I don't know about Arduino, but at least Raspberry Pi, and running Flutter on those kind of displays. Promises around real-time interrupts and the promises you have there on medical or industrial or robotics, or read the license agreement, those things make me nervous. But anywhere Linux can run, modular architectures.
Could it work though? Not that I would build it, but could you run it on a real-time platform? Because it's single-threaded. That's kind of why it reminds me of Control Logics. Right. Control Logics, you can do C++ or you can do ladder.
You need to have libc and some of those other things there. We're not the wrong people to answer the question, honestly. As low as Raspberry Pi, I know we're there. But once you get a little bit lower level and those kind of specialized platforms, we'd have to talk to other folks.
We talk to small. There are definitely some of those scenarios that make sense. I don't think it's the real-time scenarios. It's more again that sort of
IoT.
Hypothetically, yes. Google has a lot of small-scale devices, right? The Systems is not the smallest, but it's getting down there, and then there are some still smaller ones, some of which control thermostats and things like that. You can imagine some of this stuff working on very small-scale devices. We're not targeting real-time. If it works, it works, but it's not a primary focus for us. I aspire to Tesla. That would be a good example to me of Flutter running well in an embedded scenario, right? Those are the kind of experiences that Flutter is perfect for. Our timing was wrong. They built their own thing. Maybe the next time they re-platform, Flutter will be their choice. But that's the kind of experience that we think Flutter is really nice for, embedded in that kind of format.
But look up the instructions. Driven displays. I think Raspberry Pi, custom, there's efforts, if not on our repo, other people have done experiments there. So
We have an embedder API, so you can certainly run Flutter and Dart on a Raspberry Pi without going through multiple layers of abstract graphics goo. Yeah.
So I'm not a Googler, but I still follow the 20% rule. And my 20% project is, so I'm an Angular darter as well, amongst before being a Flutterer. I'm just about to do something for my 20% that's simple BWA single page app with Cloud Firestore. Am I crazy to do that in Flutter?
What are you doing? That's probably the answer.
A accounting system for the school PTO.
Wow.
So we went to the point where we can say use Flutter Web Production. We're not there today, and Tim said n months. Exactly. That's the same number here. Also n for the number of months where we'll comfortable saying run with it. Doing things. So this is something I was going to talk about. I didn't get to this notion of kind of document-based sites versus app-based sites. We don't think Flutter, like the document-based model, like if you're New York Times homepage or an article or a blog or something, like the text there and the model for printing and for SEO and for scaling, like that just works so well for documents. If you're doing document-focused stuff, we're not targeting that. We might get there eventually, who knows, but in the short term, like the old DOM way of doing it is not old. Like it works great. It's spectacular for that. So if you're doing a single page app, that's getting more towards what I think Flutter Web is designed for. We want to talk about, how text heavy it is, if text input is really important. I gave some of those caveats around we're still working on copy and paste. And so if you're doing grids of copy, paste, and right click, and you want to do that all really well, we're not there today, and I think we'll solve a lot of those problems very soon. But I would say, stay tuned.
It comes down to your tolerance for risk at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter whether it doesn't matter if it doesn't work. But what about Firestore?
So we have, speaking of engineering at Resource, so the web version of the Firebase APIs in general has been my 2% project for a while. I try to keep it working.
Kevin has 10-20% projects.
I know, which don't do the math there. It's tough to do well. So there are people, actually one of my most famous, one of the favorite questions on Flutter Web is how do I do Firebase, Firestore? There is a web API. So if you're doing if you follow the instructions, you can't use the Firebase plugin for Flutter that exists now. You can use the just Firebase. I squatted up. It wasn't me, someone else squatted on the name. So the Firebase package is mostly web. So you can use the Firestore API out of that package. It's a web specific. But people have got it to work. And we aspire, there's some gnarly stuff there, but I want to have a world where there is one Firebase package, and it does iOS and Android and web, and just one API. What's that?
How are you going to do that?
So it's kind of, again, aspiration. PM talking, when PMs say aspirational, you really should be careful. So right now, there is a single Firestore API, let's say, for Android and iOS. That is one Dart API that goes down to two separate native plugins. There's a native iOS, native Android, and then those both, at the end of the day, are probably talking about the same ports and things, the same Firestore backend,
The same gRPC messages.
I'm sure, right? And so the web is just the same, right? And so go down to the JavaScript API. We had some discussions about what we should really have is just write the whole API in Dart and use the same one everywhere. Again, easy for PMs to say. Although I think there's actually a community effort that's trying to do some of that. But that's fundamentally how we'll do it. We'll have one API, iOS, Android, JavaScript, then it all goes back to gRPC at the end of the day.
And I can actually vouch for that. So we wrote the Flutter Hackathon voting website in Flutter Web, and we did use that same Firebase package, so we were able to connect to Firebase, Firestore, for storage, for setting up real-time listeners, and it worked just perfectly out of the box. We were shocked. So
I need to add the donate button to that. It's not /Google, probably shouldn't, but I'm glad.
So I just had one question for you guys. The last 2 years of Flutter have been pretty ambitious and with tons of achievements. Right? You think about 2 years ago what Flutter was compared to this room and all the announcements you guys have done since then. So I think we're getting to a point now where I feel like a lot of people understand the merits of it, And I mean, how do you keep the hits going, right? Like, what are the next greatest, like 2 years from now, like what is the motivation now for people getting into Flutter that looking ahead, you know, and for the next 2 years, what are the things you guys see coming and how will it change and, you know, what can we look forward to?
Yeah. Wow, it's a big question. You know, I think there's a couple of things. Projects go through life cycles, right? You go through you're the kind of the young sort of barely finished projects that sounds promising on paper, but people are very skeptical of, to something that feels like it could actually get to some traction, to something that is mature and mainstream. And there's a little bit of that for all projects. Usually when projects get to that stage, they start defining their adjacencies, what else sort of to the sides makes sense. We're not even at that stage yet, right? We're still building out things. The issues, the lack of maps, info box, and things like that are good examples of that. We've got plenty to do there. Yeah, we think a lot about, you know, how do we kind of stay fresh? How do we continue to tackle new problems? The only thing that's really obvious there is that there's no end of things that we can continue to solve, right? The UI that we build today is still dependent on so many different pieces of smarts where people have to bring their own bottle, as it were. They have to create their own, fill the gaps in the framework. We think there's so much more we can do to make beautiful apps, productivity, a whole different level further. And I'm not going to talk too much about that right now because we'll have an event in a few months' time, I'm sure, and we'll invite everybody to come and hear about some of those things. But for sure, we think there's a long way we can go there. The other thing I'll say just quickly is I've been involved in, I don't know how many UI frameworks that have failed over the years.
We worked on some of those together.
Not all of those at Google. None of them at Google, in fact. But it takes time, right? Some of the projects that I worked on 10 years ago are more popular now than they were 10 years ago, just because it actually takes a long time for a big, you know, framework to land and to build the ecosystem around it. And so we think in very long-term sort of views with this kind of thing. We're building something that we plan to be around for decades, not years. Those of you who know a little bit about the engineering team will know that people have come from all kinds of different other parts of Google, as Kevin's kind of alluded to. The technical architect for Flutter used to run the HTML What's WG working group and was involved for over a decade building what became HTML5 and the future of the web. We have folk who spent you know, their entire careers working on JavaScript engines and
Java
VMs,
before that, yeah.
And yeah, so we've got a lot of talent on this team. I think it's one of the most teams where people kind of love to come and join because we're solving big thorny problems. And that gives me a lot of hope for the future, both because we've got some incredibly talented people in the team and because these are people who've thought about decade-long problems. And so, yeah, we're scratching the surface, a lot more to come. Stay tuned and stay on the journey with us. We love having you on to the right.
All right, well, that's a perfect note to end on. So, guys, let's hear it for Tim.